The morning bells of Victorian London echoed through the mist as elegant carriages rolled past towering mansions and humble workers hurried along cobbled streets. In a city where silk coats, noble titles, and overflowing fortunes often determined a person's worth, one quiet gentleman walked unnoticed beneath the gray sky. His boots were polished but worn, his coat carefully mended, and his pockets held little more than a few coins. Yet hidden beneath that simple appearance was a heart richer than anyone could imagine. It was a story that would one day leave London's proudest aristocrats speechless, and prove that true nobility could never be measured by gold alone. Among England's most respected noble families stood the household of Duke Edward Ashford, a powerful landowner whose estate stretched across the countryside, and whose influence reached the highest circles of society. His London residence was famous for glittering banquets, distinguished guests, and grand charity galas attended by politicians, military officers, bishops, and members of the royal court. Servants often said that no important decision in the county was made without first considering the Duke's opinion. Despite his immense wealth, Duke Ashford possessed a reputation unlike many noblemen of his time. He believed discipline, honesty, and compassion built stronger families than riches ever could. Although he appreciated tradition, he quietly disliked those who boasted about titles while treating ordinary people with contempt. Few understood that beneath his dignified exterior lived a father whose greatest concern was not preserving his fortune, but securing his daughter's happiness. Lady Linda Ashford, 28 years old, was admired throughout London not merely for her remarkable beauty, but for her gentle nature and graceful intelligence. Her warm smile softened every formal gathering, and her kindness towards servants earned sincere affection within the household. Wherever she appeared, wealthy lords competed for her attention, believing marriage to the Duke's daughter would elevate their influence even further. Lavish bouquets, priceless jewelry, and extravagant invitations arrived almost daily, yet none impressed her. She had grown weary of polished compliments spoken without genuine feeling. Instead of spending every afternoon attending fashionable parties, Linda often accompanied charitable organizations that distributed food, clothing, and books to struggling families. Those outings allowed her to escape endless conversations about estates and inheritances. During one chilly autumn morning outside a neighborhood church, she noticed a gentleman kneeling beside an elderly widow whose basket had spilled across the pavement. Without hesitation, he gathered every apple, brushed dust from each one, and walked the woman safely across the busy street before quietly continuing on his way. That gentleman was George Harrington. George was 32 years old, educated, thoughtful, and remarkably humble. His late father had once been a respected gentleman connected to an old noble lineage, but years of financial hardship and unresolved legal disputes had stripped the family of nearly everything they possessed. After his parents passed away, George inherited little beyond a collection of books, several personal letters, and the values they had worked tirelessly to teach him. He rented a modest room above a bookseller's shop, earning enough to survive by tutoring young students, managing accounts for local merchants, and writing formal correspondence for businessmen who admired his elegant handwriting. Though his income remained uncertain, he refused dishonest opportunities that promised quick wealth. If a client accidentally paid him extra, he always returned the difference immediately. His reputation for integrity quietly spread throughout the neighborhood. Every week George volunteered at a small community reading room, teaching children whose families could not afford private education. He often repaired damaged books with his own hands and purchased candles, so students could continue learning after sunset. When an elderly veteran struggled to pay winter rent, George secretly covered part of the expense without revealing his name. Those acts brought him no recognition, yet they filled him with quiet satisfaction. Linda encountered George again during a public lecture celebrating literature and education. Their conversation began with books but quickly revealed shared beliefs about kindness, responsibility, and service. Unlike the fashionable gentlemen she usually met, George never attempted to impress her with grand stories or expensive possessions. Instead, he listened carefully whenever she spoke, valuing her thoughts more than the privilege of standing beside a noblewoman. Over the following months, chance meetings became welcomed conversations. Sometimes they crossed paths at charity events. Sometimes they exchanged greetings inside the Duke's impressive library, where George occasionally conducted research for merchants preparing historical records. Each meeting deepened their respect for one another. George slowly realized he had fallen deeply in love with Linda, though he believed such affection could never become reality. How could a man with empty pockets hope to win the heart of a duke's daughter? Friends warned him that society would laugh at such impossible dreams. George listened politely but refused to surrender his convictions. Love, he believed, deserved honesty rather than fear. After many sleepless nights and heartfelt prayers, he made the boldest decision of his life. Wearing his carefully brushed coat, he walked through the towering gates of Ashford House and requested an audience with the Duke himself. As the massive study doors slowly opened, Duke Edward looked up from his desk and calmly asked, "Young man, what brings you to my home today?" George drew a slow breath before answering. The Duke's study was lined with towering shelves of leather-bound books, polished oak furniture, and portraits of generations past. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting warm light across the richly woven carpet. Every object in the room spoke of wealth, history, and authority. George knew he possessed none of those things. Still, he met the Duke's steady gaze without lowering his eyes. "Your Grace," he began respectfully, "I have not come seeking favor, fortune, or position. I have come because I love your daughter with all my heart. I ask only for the honor of requesting her hand in marriage." The room fell silent. The Duke folded his hands upon the desk and studied the man standing before him. George's clothes were neat but plainly worn. His boots had clearly seen many long walks through London streets. There was nothing about his appearance that suggested wealth. Yet there was something else that immediately captured the Duke's attention. George spoke without fear, without arrogance, and without pretending to be anything other than himself. After several quiet moments, the Duke rose from his chair and slowly walked toward the fireplace. "Tell me honestly," he said, "what estate do you own?" "None, your Grace." "What title have you inherited?" "None." "What fortune can you promise my daughter?" George hesitated only briefly. "I cannot promise riches," he admitted. "I can promise faithful work, honest decisions, respect, loyalty, and a husband who will never stop trying to make her smile." The Duke remained thoughtful. "And if difficult years should come," he continued, "if business fails, illness visits your home, or fortune turns its back upon you, what then?" George answered quietly, "Then I will face those hardships beside her instead of leaving her to face them alone. Wealth may disappear overnight, but character should remain when everything else has been taken away." Those words lingered in the room. Unknown to George, Lady Linda had been walking through the nearby corridor when she heard familiar voices. The study door had not fully closed, and although she intended to continue on her way, she paused when she realized George was speaking with her father. She remained respectfully outside, hearing only portions of their conversation. The Duke asked another question. "Many men claim to love when life is comfortable. How do I know your love is genuine?" George smiled softly. "Because I loved your daughter before I believed there was even the smallest chance she could ever become my wife. I expected nothing in return for my feelings. Loving her has already made me a better man." Outside the room, Linda quietly wiped away a tear. The Duke slowly nodded. "I have one final question." George stood silently. "Why should I entrust my greatest treasure to a man with empty pockets?" George answered with complete sincerity. "Because I hope, your Grace, that one day she will remember not the size of the house we lived in, but the peace she felt inside it. The Duke looked into George's eyes for what felt like an eternity. Then, to George's complete surprise, the older gentleman smiled. "My daughter," the Duke said warmly, "needs a good man, not a wealthy one." George stared in disbelief. The Duke motioned toward two chairs near the fireplace. "Sit with me." Still overwhelmed, George obeyed. "There is something you should know," the Duke continued. "Before any father gives away his daughter's hand, he makes inquiries." George looked confused. "For months," the Duke explained, "I have quietly asked about you." George's eyes widened. "I spoke with merchants, teachers, clergymen, servants, neighbors, stable workers, even children." The Duke smiled knowingly. "Do you know what every one of them said?" George slowly shook his head. "They told me of the gentleman who returned money that did not belong to him, the tutor who refused dishonest work, the young man who paid an old widow's rent without seeking recognition, the volunteer who spent evenings teaching children instead of pursuing comfort. They all described the same person." The Duke leaned forward. "They described you." George lowered his head, embarrassed rather than proud. "I simply did what anyone should do." "No," replied the Duke gently. "Many speak of honor, few quietly practice it." At that very moment, Linda could no longer remain hidden. She stepped into the study, her eyes shining with emotion. "Father." The Duke turned and smiled. "I believe you have heard enough." Linda walked toward George. "I have." She looked directly at him. "You never once mentioned your sacrifices." George answered softly. "They were never sacrifices. Helping others was simply the right thing to do." The Duke placed a reassuring hand upon George's shoulder. "When you first entered this house, you believed yourself poor. Yet every person I questioned described you as one of the richest men they had ever known." George's voice almost failed him. "I do not deserve such praise." "Perhaps," the Duke replied, "that humility is precisely why you do." He extended his hand. "You have my blessing to marry my daughter." George accepted it with trembling gratitude. Linda smiled brighter than ever before. Word of the engagement soon spread through London's highest circles. Wealthy noble families expressed disbelief. Some whispered that the Duke had lost his judgment. Others quietly laughed that Lady Linda would marry a man without fortune or title. Invitations to fashionable gatherings suddenly became less frequent, and gossip filled drawing rooms across the city. Yet neither George nor Linda allowed cruel opinions to cloud their happiness. They continued planning a modest but joyful wedding, believing love needed no audience to prove its worth. Far beyond London's bustling streets, however, a royal courier carrying sealed legal documents had begun a journey that would change George's life forever before the wedding day arrived unexpectedly. Wedding morning arrived beneath clear blue skies, and London seemed determined to witness the unusual union that had become the city's favorite conversation. Elegant carriages crowded the streets leading to St. Bartholomew's Cathedral. Ladies stepped gracefully onto the stone pathway, wearing fashionable gowns trimmed with lace, while gentlemen adjusted polished hats and exchanged whispers about the Duke's extraordinary decision. Many had attended less to celebrate love than to satisfy their curiosity about the poor man who had somehow won the heart of Lady Linda Ashford. Inside the magnificent cathedral, fresh flowers decorated every pew, stained glass windows scattered colorful light across the marble floor, and musicians quietly rehearsed gentle hymns. The Duke greeted respected guests with calm dignity, refusing to acknowledge the doubtful glances directed toward his family. Linda waited in a private chamber, dressed in an elegant ivory gown that reflected both noble tradition and simple grace. She felt no anxiety about wealth or status. Her heart rested peacefully because she knew exactly whom she had chosen. Outside, George approached the cathedral on foot. He wore the same carefully tailored suit he had owned for years. Although freshly pressed and immaculately clean, it lacked the luxurious fabrics displayed by London's aristocracy. His polished shoes carried signs of long use, and he carried no jeweled cane, no expensive watch, and no entourage of servants. He walked alone with quiet confidence, smiling politely at everyone he passed. Several guests noticed immediately. "There he is," one gentleman murmured. "Surely that cannot be the groom," another replied. A group of young aristocrats exchanged amused smiles. "The Duke's daughter deserves a prince, not a penniless scholar." One lady covered her mouth to hide a laugh. Perhaps he became lost on his way to the servants' entrance. Soon the whispers spread through the gathering. People glanced at George's modest clothing before looking at one another with disbelief. A few laughed openly. Others shook their heads with theatrical sympathy for the Duke. Several wealthy suitors who had once hoped to marry Linda smiled with quiet satisfaction, convinced the day would become a lasting embarrassment for the Ashford family. George heard every word. He answered none of them. Instead, he thanked the cathedral porter for opening the great wooden doors and wished the elderly man good health. His kindness surprised the porter far more than any elegant speech could have done. Moments later, the music signaled that the ceremony was about to begin. Just then, the sound of galloping horses echoed through the square outside. Every conversation stopped. A procession of magnificent royal carriages rolled toward the cathedral entrance, each bearing the official crest of the crown. Uniformed guards stepped down first, followed by distinguished officials carrying sealed cases wrapped in crimson velvet. The unexpected arrival immediately transformed laughter into puzzled silence. The chief royal commissioner requested permission to address the Duke before the ceremony. The cathedral grew perfectly still. Standing before the assembled guests, the commissioner unrolled a formal document sealed with wax. "By authority granted under the crown," he announced, "the long-standing inheritance dispute concerning the House of Ravensshire has been concluded." Curious whispers filled the room. The commissioner continued. "After exhaustive examination of family records, parish registers, legal testimony, and historical claims, the rightful successor has been officially identified." George looked around in confusion, believing the announcement concerned someone else entirely. Then the commissioner spoke the name. "George Harrington." Complete silence followed. George blinked in astonishment. "There must be some mistake," he said quietly. "There is no mistake," the commissioner replied with a respectful smile. "Your late father was the lawful heir. The unresolved proceedings delayed recognition for many years. Today those proceedings have reached their conclusion." Another official stepped forward carrying additional documents. "The Crown hereby recognizes George Harrington as the lawful Duke of Ravensshire." Gasps echoed throughout the cathedral. The commissioner explained that the Ravensshire estates included prosperous farmland, thriving shipping investments, historic properties, valuable libraries, and charitable trusts accumulated over generations. Careful stewardship had preserved the fortune during the lengthy legal process. George had inherited not only an ancient title, but one of the greatest fortunes in England. The guests who had laughed only moments earlier stared in speechless disbelief. Some lowered their eyes. Others looked deeply embarrassed. The proud gentleman who had mocked George's appearance suddenly found no words at all. George himself remained silent for several moments. Finally, he looked at the commissioner and asked the only question that truly mattered to him. "May I still marry Lady Linda exactly as we planned?" A gentle smile spread across the Duke's face. He stepped forward and placed both hands upon George's shoulders. "My dear boy," he said warmly, "you became worthy the day you entered my home with honesty in your heart. These documents have changed your title, but they have not changed your character." Linda approached, her eyes shining with joyful tears. "I loved you yesterday," she whispered. "I love you today. And had these papers never arrived, I would have loved you every day afterward." George smiled with grateful relief. The ceremony began at last. The Duke proudly escorted Linda down the aisle, placing her hand into George's with complete confidence. Friends, servants, Townspeople and nobles stood together as the couple exchanged heartfelt vows promising faithfulness, compassion, patience, and lifelong devotion. The cathedral that had echoed with laughter only an hour earlier now overflowed with sincere applause and quiet admiration. After the ceremony, the Duke addressed the gathered guests. "Many judged this gentleman by the fabric of his coat," he said. "I judged him by the strength of his heart. Wealth can be inherited. Character must be earned." No one challenged those words. In the months that followed, George accepted his unexpected responsibilities with remarkable humility. Rather than seeking greater luxury, he carefully restored neglected villages on his estates, expanded hospitals founded by his ancestors, supported schools for children from every background, and ensured widows and elderly workers received proper care. Linda worked beside him in every charitable effort, believing privilege carried the responsibility to serve others generously. Their home became known as a place where noble guests and ordinary families were welcomed with equal warmth and respect. Years later, people remembered the wedding not because England's richest duke had been revealed at the altar, but because a powerful father had chosen character before fortune, and a noble daughter had loved an honest man before discovering his title. Those who had laughed learned a lesson they never forgot. Appearances may deceive the eyes, but kindness reveals true greatness. And in the end, George's richest inheritance was never his vast estates or ancient title. It was the unwavering love, trust, and respect he had earned long before anyone knew his name deserved a crown.